If you're a distracted and deluded person, like I obviously am, you can become interested in complex social phenomena as a way to mirror your sense of multiple entry points. You might develop an interest in the way art has historically worked as a locus of skepticism. This will inevitably include self-conscious ideas in terms of cultural refusal and sidestepping. I always found the idea of consolidating form and content difficult. Another big problem in the recent past has been the question, what is the idea behind your work? A lot of my work is derived from how to get around the singularity problem and instead find multiple sources, often self-created multiple starting points. Certainly, a lot of my structures and projects are not resolved in the sense that dealing with any specific thing doesn't necessarily lead you to a moment of consolidation or sublimation or any of these things that art's traditionally supposed to do. The point of entry into the ideas is multiple. Certain things act as lures or attractors, while other things hold you away. If you're interested in providing a critique of the middle ground, then you have to consider questions of contingency, strategy, negotiation, compromise, and refusal. These are the abstractions at the core of the work. And recently I've realized that the key marker here is a re-examination of the notion of difference in relation to cultural production.
So that was a Liam Gillick. And in response, in some way, this is a Simon Critchley. Some perhapses, insurrection and the risk of abstraction. We are living through a long anti-1960s. The various anti-capitalist experiments in communal living and collective existence that have defined that period seem to us either quaintly passé, laughably unrealistic, or dangerously misguided. Having grown up and thrown off such seemingly childish ways, we now think we know better than to try to bring heaven crashing down to earth and construct concrete utopias. To that extent, despite our occasional and transient enthusiasms and Obama-isms, we are all political realists. Indeed, most of us are passive nihilists and cynics. This is why we still require a belief in something like original sin, namely, that there is something ontologically defective about what it means to be human. As I suggested above, the Judeo-Christian conception of original sin finds its modern analogues in Freud's variation on the Schopenhauerian disjunction between desire and civilization, Heidegger's ideas of facticity and fallenness, and the Hobbesian anthropology that drives Schmitt's defense of authoritarianism and dictatorship. Without the conviction that the human condition is essentially flawed and dangerously rapacious, we would have no way of justifying our disappointment, and nothing gives us a greater thrill than satiating our sense of exhaustion and ennui by polishing the bars of our prison cell by reading a little John Gray. Gray provides a very persuasive Darwinian variant on the idea of original sin. It is a theory of evolution that explains the fact that we are Homo sapiens. Nothing can be done about it. Humanity is a plague. It is indeed true that those utopian political movements of the 1960s, in which an echo of utopian millenarian movements like the Free Spirit could be heard, such as the Situationist International. These led to various forms of disillusionment, disintegration, and extreme cases, disaster. Experiments in the collective ownership of property or in the communal living based on sexual freedom without the repressive institution of the family seem like distant, whimsical cultural memories captured in dog-eared, yellowed paperbacks and grainy, poor-quality film. As a child of punk, economic collapse, and the widespread social violence in the United Kingdom in the late 1970s, it is a world that I have always struggled to understand. Perhaps such communal experiments tried to be too pure and were overfull of righteous conviction. Perhaps they were, in a word, too moralistic to ever endure. Perhaps such experiments were doomed because of what we might call a politics of abstraction, and the sense of being overly attached to an idea at the expense of a frontal denial of reality. Perhaps, indeed. At their most extreme, say in the activities of the Weather Underground, the Red Army faction, etc., yada yada, the moral certitude of the closed and pure community becomes fatally linked to redemptive, cleansing violence. Terror becomes the means to bring home terror becomes the means to bring about the end of virtue, such is the logic of Jacobianism. The death of individuals is but a speck on the vast heroic canvas of the class struggle. Such thinking culminated in a heroic politics of violence, where acts of abduction, kidnapping, hijacking, and assassination were justified through an attachment to a set of ideas. As a character in Jean-Luc Godard's Notre Musique remarks, to kill a human being in order to defend an idea is not to defend an idea, it is to kill a human being. Perhaps such groups were too attached to the idea of immediacy, the propaganda of the violent deed as the impatient attempt to storm the heavens. Perhaps such experiments lacked an understanding of politics as a constant and concrete process of mediation. That is, the mediation between a subjective ethical commitment based on a general principle and the experience of local organization that builds fronts and alliances between disparate groups with often conflicting sets of interests. By definition, such a process of mediation is never pure and never complete. Are these utopian experiments in community dead? Or do they live on in some form? I'd like to make two suggestions for areas in which this utopian impulse might live on. Two experiments, if you will. One from contemporary art, one from contemporary radical politics. These two areas can be interestingly linked. Indeed, if a tendency marks our time, then it is the increasing difficulty in separating forms of collaborative art from experimental politics. Perhaps such utopian experiments in community live on in the institutionally sanctioned spaces of the contemporary art world. One thinks of projects like l'Association des Temps Libérés of 1995 or Utopia Station of 2003. As well as many other examples gathered together in a show at the Guggenheim Museum in New York in fall 2008, the Any Space Whatever. In the work of artists like Philippe Perigno and Liam Gillick, or curators like Hans Ulrich Obrist and Maria Lind, there is a deeply felt situationist nostalgia for ideas of collectivity, action, self-management, collaboration, and indeed the idea of the group as such. In such art practice, which Nicolas Bourriaud has successfully branded as relational, art is the acting out of a situation in order to see if, in Obrist's words, something like a collective intelligence might exist. As Gillick notes, maybe it would be better if we worked in groups of three. So much contemporary art and politics obsessed with the figure of the group and of work as collaboration, perhaps all the way to the refusal of work and the cultivation of anonymity. Of course, the problem with such contemporary utopian art experiments is twofold. On the one hand, they are only enabled and legitimated through the cultural institutions of the art world, and thus utterly enmeshed in the circuits of commodification and spectacle that they seek to subvert. And, on the other hand, the dominant mode for approaching an experience of the communal is through the strategy of reenactment. One doesn't engage in a bake heist, one reenacts Patty Hearst's adventures with the Symbionese Liberation Army in a warehouse in Brooklyn, or whatever. Situationist detournement is replayed as obsessively played. Situationist detournement is replayed as obsessively planned reenactment. The category of reenactment has become hegemonic in contemporary art, specifically as a way of thinking the relation between art and politics. Perhaps radical politics has also become reenactment. Fascinating as I find such experiments in the work of the artists involved, I suspect here what we might call a mannerist situationism. A mannerist situationism, where the old problem of recuperation does not even apply because such art is completely co-opted by the socio-economic system which provides its lifeblood.
I'm a European socialist. I believe that people need to get together, organize, and make things work better without rationalizing their own redundancy. The 1970s were a moment of failure and confusion on the left, and the emergence of a significant new pragmatic radicalism as the neoliberal agenda was forced into place. It was also a disturbing time. We were told that the post-war experiments towards the creation of a better living and working environment had already failed. This was generally an attempt by right-wing politicians to use the urban fabric as a site of otherness that could be demonized and used as a scare tactic towards gaining political support from the suburbs and countryside. The developing narratives of difference and progress were turned into an accusation. My work is often related to attempts to recuperate the progressive moments of applied modernism in the context of difference, not to picture it or illustrate it, but produce a parallel narrative of potential. The idea that the post-war is complete and the claim that the edge of Europe is being reached are important points of departure when trying to imagine the potential of the discursive.
So one of the texts in question, written here by Liam Gillick, entitled, "Maybe it would be better if we worked in groups of three." Or rather, a question, maybe it would be better if we worked in groups of three? The discursive. Some people are the motor of the event, like an animator bringing characters to life. A character is drawn and through this process is free to behave in whatever way the animator wants it to. At our event, you don't know exactly who animates who, but it is definitely taking place. Everyone is part of the same story, but with separate lives. They are in the style of recent manga comics from Japan, where each character has a complex formulation that frequently changes from episode to episode or from story to story. Narratives are stretched and the stories have no specific end. The active people sometimes prefix a name with R, as in R. Wallace or R. Hugh. Each participant could be the son or the daughter of another person at the party. You never notice this, but these relationships give some of the interactions between people an aim and a story. There are also passive groups at the event. Maybe they are just visitors observing the party. They don't react much, they read a lot, talk a great deal, and sometimes exchange pictures. In the same way that children make collections of things, the passive groups pass pictures around. It is not clear what they say to each other, mumbling a bit. Conversations that are always difficult to overhear. That's from Philip Perigno. Snow Dancing, 1995. A discursive model of praxis that has... A discursive model of praxis has developed within the critical art context over the last 20 years. It is the offspring of critical theory and improvised, self-organized structures. It is the basis of art that involves the dissemination of information. It plays with social models and presents speculative constructs both within and beyond traditional gallery spaces. It is indebted to conceptual art's reframing of relationships, and it requires decentered and revised histories in order to evolve. If we want to understand tendencies in art, we have to look at the structures that underscore the sharing of ideas. This is especially true when we consider discursive processes to be the base of self-conscious art practice. It is necessary to find a way to describe, map, and analogize the processes that have actually been taking place under the surface of recent models of curating and artistic practice. I'm trying for a moment to get away from anecdotal, local, and geographical relationships to artistic activity and away from special event consciousness. At the same time, I want to look at echoes in the culture that might provide a clue to parallel productive techniques. The discursive is the key strategy employed by the most dynamic contemporary artists, whether they are providing a contribution to a larger model of exchange or using discursive strategies as a structural tool within their own work, such as Rudy Medina, for example. I'm trying to test the validity of this discursive framework in light of what has developed in the culture since the fall of the Berlin Wall. There are some returns and absences that may affect our ability to continue as before. We also need to examine the notion of the discursive as a model of production in its own right, alongside the production of objects for consideration or exchange. The discursive is what produces the work, and, in the form of critical and impromptu exchanges, it is also the desired result. The use of the word discursive includes the following considerations. First, the movement between subjects without or beyond order. Second, a set of discussions marked by their adherence to one or more notions of analytical reason. At no point does my use of the word really imply coherence with notions of discursive democracy as posited by Habermas and others, yet within the cultural terrain it does have some connection to the idea of melding public deliberation while retaining the notion of individual practice within the group. The discursive is a practice that offers one the opportunity to be a relatively unexamined, free agent within a collective project. While the discursive appears to be an open generator of positions, it actually functions best when it allows one to hide within the collective. It allows the artist to develop a set of arguments and individual positions without having to conform to an established model of artistic or educational quality. Incomplete projects and partial contributions are central to an effectively progressive, critical environment. But in the discursive, they are not expressed. Rather, they are perpetually reformed. The discursive needs to preserve the sense of reclaimed speculation in relation to lived future models if it is to retain its semi-autonomy in relation to instrumentalizing or divisive, chaotic and insincere market rationalizations. Repeat. The discursive needs to preserve this sense of reclaimed speculation in relation to lived future models if it is to retain its semi-autonomy in relation to instrumentalizing or divisive, chaotic and insincere market rationalizations. Complicated fucking thing. The discursive framework differentiates certain collective models, not the other way around. It is a mode of generating ideas and placing structures into the culture that emerges from collaborative, collective, or negotiated positions, rather than as varied forms of pure expression or supersubjectivity. However, the discursive also provides a space where all these approaches can be included. The rise of content-heavy discussions, seminars, symposia, and discussion programs, alongside every serious art project over the last 20 years, is very significant here. This phenomenon has given us a lot of time to excuse ourselves, to qualify ourselves, and to provide an excess of specific positions that are not necessarily in sync with what is presented in the spaces for art. These discussions are functional parallels that project in many directions. They are free zones of real production. They have also become an essential component of both didactic and contingent projects. Yet the discursive as a form of art practice in its own right is not reliant on these official parallel events. It both goes beyond and absorbs such moments, making them both material and structure, operating openly in opposition to official programming. The discursive leads to the proliferation of the short text and statement, which both cover up and announce. The site of production today often exists within the text alone. The text is the key event, the key moment, the idea carrier, as well as the collective project itself. The critical text is also the voice of the the critical text is also the voice of the curator. The site of the critical text is now often produced by the person who is an implicated multiple personality within the cultural field. The anxiety of contemporary curating is not the cliché of the idea of the curator as mega-artist or the curator as neurotic traveler. The anxiety is that the critical voice has been merged with that of the curatorial. A misunderstanding has emerged here in the reaction to relational aesthetics, with the implication that this curatorial voice directs the critical flow. But this analysis of relational aesthetics got the moment of engagement the wrong way around. Critical self-consciousness was activated before the predictive text backtracked and set the scene. This is a common phenomenon of the discursive, the post-description of critical awareness, often in a straightforward form. The idea of a directed series of actions comes after the negotiated quality of the discursive. Moments of entry into the critical framework are muddled and inverted as a result of the struggle over the text having been transferred from the artist to the curator. Yet we still make assumptions about critical potential emerging from the moment at which a flow is identified, rather than from the flow itself. Recently, we have seen the rise of a new group of people who have studied art history but have resisted or found no place within the standard systems of curating. This new non-group has been completely identified, manipulated, or instrumentalized. This new non-group has not been completely identified, manipulated, or instrumentalized by the dominant culture yet. They appear to be deeply embedded within hierarchical academic structures, but also do not deal with the merging of voices that constitutes a symbiotic alliance between the discursive and the curatorial. They have studied art history, but do not at all want to be curators or traditional critics either. They've started developing a series of relationships, discussions, and texts that have created a new series of links between the potential of the discursive framework and much more traditional forms of academic work. The greater part of this new work is focused on trying to understand where the critical flow exists within the culture. All of this is based on the understanding that statements are also events. Statements depend on the conditions from which they emerge and begin their existence within a field of discourse. Statements as events are important within the discursive. They provide a location from which to propose a physical potential beyond the immediate art context. Putting a statement into play will create an event at some point, or a series of events projected into the near future to recuperate the recent past. By the time a generation born in the early 1960s had become activated recipients of a post-war social dynamic, they were simultaneously told that the physical manifestations of it were failing. They were told that they were within something that might appear to be succeeding and functioning in theory, but that certain markers of progressive, modern existence were not functional, wouldn't work, and no one wanted them. Reconfiguring the recent past accounts for this tension. It is a crucial component of a desire to be involved in a discursive frame that is often marked by architectural and structural legacies of the recent past, from public housing projects to communal experiments, which were viewed as a failure on both the right and the left. At the heart of the discursive is a re-examination of the day before, as a model for understanding how to behave, activate, and present. It tries to get to the point just before the only option was to play the tuba to the workers. In the past, I have used this quite frequently as a device. The day before the brass band became the only option. The day before the mob became the workers. The day before the factory closed. The day before Hotel California was released. The idea of a French bar in the middle of nowhere with nothing to listen to and everyone waiting for the arrival of the soft future. The role of the discursive is to not look back too far. However, this creates peculiar problems. Reoccupation The role of the discursive is to not look back too far. However, this creates peculiar problems. Reoccupation, recuperation, and aimless renovation are the daily activities of a unified Europe, and the function of the discursive framework as well, creating engagement and providing activity. However, the intellectual and ideological implications are rather more problematic. We are currently in a situation in which suspension and repression are the dominant models. There is anxiety about who controls the reshaping of the stories of the recent past. The discursive framework has been predicated upon the rejection of the idea of a dominant authored voice. Clear-cut authored content is considered to be politically, socially, and ideologically suspect. However, there is still the feeling that the stories get told, that the past is being reconfigured, and that the near future gets shaped. There's a constant anxiety within the discursive frame about who is doing this, who is marking time. The discursive is the only structure that allows you to project a problem just out of reach and to work with that permanent displacement. Every other mode merely reflects a problem, generates a problem, denies a problem, and so on. The discursive framework projects a problem just out of reach, and this is why it can also confront a socio-economic system that bases its growth upon projections. And the discursive art process we are constantly projecting. We are projecting that something will lead to something else at some point. True work, true activity, true significance will happen in a constant, perpetual displacement. This permanent displacement provides a location for refusal and collective ennui. The projection of the critical moment is the political potential of the discursive. It is not a location for action, but instead provides an infinite suspension of critical moments, the opposite of performance. This is its just around the cornerness, a permanent interplay of microcritical expressions within the context of a setting. Projects are realized that expose a power relationship with the culture. They achieve this through an adherence to parasitical techniques, destroying relations of production through a constant layering of profoundly differing and contradictory aims. Somehow, it might be possible to bring together small groupings and create temporary, suspended, semi-autonomous frameworks. It is possible that we have seen a rise in the idea of parasitical relationships to the point where they have reached a fluid state of acceptance. We may have reached a moment of constant reoccupation, recuperation, and aimless renovation. Maybe the discursive makes possible a parasite without a host, feeding off copies of itself, speaking to itself, regenerating among its own kind. The discursive demonstrates a clear desire to produce situations that are open and exchange-oriented in tension with the forces that encourage self-redundancy. It is an activation of counter methods. We've had flexibility and now we are redundant, yet we refuse to stop working. The discursive cultural framework is the only way to challenge the forces that encourage self-redundancy, as it internalizes and expresses consciousness of the most complex and imploded forms of the post-operaistic models of developed capitalism. The notion that capitalism mutates in the face of a reluctant workforce rather than due to some naturalistic quality or due to its own drive. Team-worked, flexibilized environments are also a way to induce people to create predictive models that are resistant to true projections of future circumstances. Everything is permanently conditional and contingent and needs to be predicted in speculative form. This phenomenon is combined with the increased sophistication of the dominant culture in finding ways to use and absorb earlier critical structures in order to create a degree of information control. The discursive adopts and co-opts this structural approach too, but to different ends. It is the only way to offer a functional parallel to the dominant culture. In a discursive frame, there is always a critical double that has a degree of parallelity with the machinations of globalized capital. The discursive always functions in parallel, or just across from the idea of something that is already taking place structurally within society. This is its strength and its weakness. The political potential of the discursive framework comes from its being simultaneously out of reach and too close. It is art functioning as a structural parallel to contemporary working dilemmas in the dominant culture. It is a discursive frame. In a discursive frame, there is always an element that parallels the machinations of globalized capital. That is both its strength and its weakness. It starts from the position of understanding the process of redundancy via flexibility, and it co-opts that process for different ends in order to redirect its apparent loss.
So if we agree we're in a post-utopian situation where consensus has exploded into the devastating logic of the neoliberal, then how are things still being planned and executed? I'm interested in apparently secondary factors, like this 20th century battle between planning and speculation, rather than detailed discussions about the ironic failure of modernism. I'm also involved in researching and playing with the suppression of the left in a US context, and looking for earlier pragmatic visions of how things could be. I'm interested in the gap left behind by this 20th century battle between speculation and planning. Strategy, compromise, renovation, critique are the tools. These factors all affect the final look of any project. I'm not trying to synchronize with a building or a site, but I'm attempting to overlay a set of concepts on top of a structure that functions as a structural alternative. Within this frame, of course, some of Bourdieu's ideas remain relevant: the relation of the cultural sphere to the corporate sphere, and a play with all the tensions that result from a consciousness of social and cultural capital. Maybe this is all the tragedy and potential of an artist like me, born in the suburbs.
The experimental factory. There is a doorman working at the entrance who's very good at recognizing people. He is also a judge of character based on facial appearance. However, he is blindfolded. The doorman is accompanied by a colleague who is unable to move, tied to a chair, incapable of physical activity. At the right time, when the music has finally stopped, people stream out past the doorman. After their activity and all their engagement with the party, the mood is subdued. People have just leave normally. Not making any fuss, no rushing, just moving away. There are no lengthy periods spent milling around, talking and looking at cars. At the end of this party, there's just a group of people quietly going on their way. Maybe we're trying to catch a moment. Maybe an earlier moment. Maybe it's a Volvo moment. June 17th, 1974, when the view from the factory was of the trees and the way to work together was as a team. And we know that the future is going to work out, that everything is a trajectory as long as we can keep things this way and Ford doesn't buy the company. For those who grew up in post-war Europe, notions of group work were embedded in educational systems, from preschool playgroups through the organizing structures of management. With group discussion and teamwork, we find a set of social models that carry complex implications for people who think they can create something using a related, if semi-autonomous methodology. The discursive is wedded to the notion of post-war social democracy. It is both a product of its education systems and subject to its critical potentials and collapses. The European context has surrounded itself with experiment machines in the culture. The discursive framework's success or failure is connected to various post-war phenomena connected to identity politics and post-colonial theory. At the same time, the discursive is suspicious and resistant to the idea of a key protagonist. Without key protagonists, however, it is very hard to know what to do, when to occupy, and when to function. However, the lack of leading voices does permit the discursive to evolve and include. If we accept the post-war period as a closed one, we have to think harder about whether the discursive is merely a gesture towards recuperation of ideas, places, and values. The discursive frame may merely be playing out various recuperative projects that are tacitly encouraged with the terrain of closure and globalization simultaneously. The de-centered quality of critical art practices meets an anxiety about the combination of the localized and the internationalized. This contradictory quality is exemplified by the discursive frame, with its displays of the local to the international and vice versa, within the context of globalized cultural journeys. The discursive offers the potential for art to operate within smallish groupings out of sync with contemporary circumstances, yet deeply embedded with its values and flows. This has a lot to do with a coalescence of smallish groupings, which then play out a suspension of aims and results within a context of indifference and projected future meetings. The potential of the discursive framework is to engage the out of reach and the too close simultaneously, art functioning as a structural parallel to contemporary working dilemmas. A dominant, visible feature of certain developed late modern art practices is the idea that prior to being manufactured, a product must be sold. The discursive makes use of theories of immaterial labor in order to account for the blurred factors that surround and produce commodity value, to understand the set of factors that produce the informational and cultural content of a commodity. The discursive becomes a negotiation and demonstration of immaterial labor used for other ends. Marx described the idea of identifying the true value of a chair in opposition to the commodity value of a chair. It is one of the philosophically weakest parts of capital. Marx's notion that a chair has an essential value prior to its commodification, a natural chairness before being corrupted and commodified by capitalism, is at the heart of a classic understanding of post-Duchampian art. This idea is exceeded and abandoned by the discursive, in sync with the recent critical texts on commodity value. I've worked on the Volvo question for the last few years. Most of my research on Volvo has been done through Brazilian academic papers concerning the legacy of 1970s production techniques in Scandinavia and models of flexibility, collaboration, and the idea of a better working environment in an ideally productive post-Fordist context. There has been a synchronization of desire and structure. In the last 10 or 15 years, discursive, fragmented, atomized, content-heavy art projects have somehow freed themselves from classical ideas concerning the problem of commodity culture. They've taken on the deep structure of work and life. In the Volvo factory, you can see trees while you are making the cars. But you are still making cars, never taking a walk in the woods. Where are the models for contemporary art production in the recent past? Is it Volvo? Is it the collective? Or is it the infinite display of the super-subjective? Do these factors share a similar cultural DNA? The idea of collective action and the idea of being able to determine the speed with which you produce a car, whether you produce it in a group or individually, at night or very slowly, seems close to the question of how to make art over the last 50 years. At Volvo, people ended up creating more and more free time, and during that free time they talked about ways to work faster. In both the cultural sphere and the traditional productive sphere, the trauma and attractiveness of infinite flexibility led to the logic of redundancy. In the end, Ford bought the company and reintroduced the standard production line, not because it was more efficient in pure capitalist terms, but because it reinforced relations of production. One of the reasons why I think the factory needs to be looked at again is that the factory, as a system, allows you to look at relationships in a totalizing way. In terms of productive potential, the struggle between speculation and planning has been one of the greatest struggles of the 20th century. We can now say that speculation won, and that the rhetoric of planning has become something we do for the people we do not know what to do with. We plan for them, but everyone else should speculate. The factory model is of use here. The factory has a planned quality in spite of the fact that it is always the playing field of the speculative. The myth is that speculation lures production, lures industry, lures investment, and in this way the factory is always caught in a psychological and philosophical dilemma. In order to effectively activate speculation, you have to plan. In the Soviet Union, every large city had an experimental factory. The experimental factory is a dynamic paradox, a model for the experimental without experiments. The factory that exists but does not produce. The idea of the experimental factory or workshop remains a dynamic legacy within the notion of productive cultural work. The post-war social project activated compromised forms of earlier idealized modernisms and created a mesh of alleviated working circumstances that left behind the experimental factory as an attractive model of potential. You can draw a parallel between the rise of the experimental factory as a functional promise and the way critical cultural exhibition structures developed alongside it. Without even considering the common phenomenon of occupying abandoned plants of the recent past as the site of art, these exhibition structures did so according to a program of regeneration within the mainstream contemporary art context. Perhaps it is possible to explain the discursive cultural framework within a context of difference and collectivity, difference being the key word that defines our time, and collectivity being the thing that is so hard to achieve while frequently being so longed for. We have to negotiate and recognize difference and collectivity simultaneously. It is an aspect of social consciousness that is exemplified in the art context. As social definitions and processes of recognition, difference and collectivity feed from the examples of modern and contemporary art. Art is nurtured and encouraged in return by way of a cultural permission that grants a space for that which cannot be tolerated, but can be accommodated under the conditions of neoliberal globalization, that thing. The discursive thrives when we are increasingly alienated from sites of traditional production, owing to the displacing effects of globalization and the increasing tendency towards infinite subcontracting. Struggles over the site of production still exist, but they are constantly displaced and projected. The struggles are reported, but are sometimes resistant to identification across borders. They exist within a context that offers an excessive assertion of specificity. as well as tense arguments on the left about how to accept difference and protect the local. Difference and collectivity are semi-autonomous concepts in an art context. The logic of their pursuit leads us to the conclusion that we should destroy all traditional relations of production in order to encourage a constant recognition of disagreement and profoundly different aims within a context of desire. The focus of the discursive is more on the aims and structural efficacy of the cultural exercise than on what is being produced. In turn, what is produced operates in parallel, unfettered by the requirement to be the total story. But all this is problematized by nostalgia for the group. We are sometimes enthralled to structures from the recent past that were not supposed to be a model for anything. Some of the structures that we use as cultural producers echo a past that was part of a contingent set of accommodations and dynamic stresses within the post-war social project. Around this, there remain old relationships of production that still exist outside complex theories of the post-industrial that are at the heart of post-war developed societies. We can see how this developed and left traces in the culture. Consider the history of the French group Medvedkin, which made films between 1967 and 1974 in the context of factories and other sites of productions. They worked, filmed, and agitated at the Lip watch factory in France, and subsequently in the Peugeot factory in Sochaux. What you see very clearly in these films is a shift that is mirrored in the dominant art context. When looking today at one of their films shot in 1967, you do not see any superficial or linguistic differences between those who run the factory, those who work in the factory, and those who criticize the factory from outside. They are all from the same culture. Physically, they look the same. Though certain differences of detail can be determined, they are nuanced and require acute class consciousness. The effects of post-colonialism have not yet shifted the source of cheap labor from the various colonies to the neighborhood of the consumer. They are attempting to play as a brass band to a group of silent, clearly embarrassed immigrant car workers, primarily from North Africa. Through the series of films, you see a clarification and separation of aesthetics in terms of identification, language, and techniques of protest. Simultaneously, you see a conspicuous drop in easy communication. Modes of address have been separated. Different groupings are talking, but only within each group, and each group has developed a sophisticated role-playing function in relation to the others. They demonstrate positions to each other. This shift towards the notion of a public faced by a complex display of self-conscious role-playing is familiar within an art context. It does not lack insincerity, and it does not lack genuine political engagement. It is a functional parallel. We have created the conditions for the experimental, but no actual experiments, or vice versa. Micro-communities of redundancy have joined together to play with the difference between art time and work time. The question is how to develop a discursive project without becoming an experimental factory, without slipping into a set of conditions that lead to a certain redundancy. It is the attempt to hold the collective on this brink that energizes the discursive context. The discursive is peopled by artists who increasingly accept a large number of permanently redundant citizens, and who have come to terms with the notion of the permanently part-time worker in the face of the permanently educated artist. The notion of continual and permanent education is used in different cultures in order to escape what are actually clear political differences to do with class, situation, and power. It is the promise to the poor child of a way to escape bad conditions, but within the discursive, the notion of self-improvement is ideologically specific and accompanies a philosophy connected to post-war power structures. My grandfather's questions always concerned what I would do with all the leisure time I would have in the future. The question now is, how do you know how much leisure time you have? We have to address the reduction of leisure as a promise and as a marker within the post-war. The discursive is linked to the question of who is managing time. Control of time was traditionally the dominant managerial tool, and it was rightly challenged. Self-management has subsequently become generalized in a post-industrial environment. It is the way even mundane jobs are advertised now. The idea has become that it is essentially better to manage your own time within a framework that involves limitless amounts of work, with no concrete barrier between working and non-working. This is something that underscores the discursive frame, the potentially neurotic, anxiety-provoking situation within which we find cultural producers operating. It has superficial advantages and clear disadvantages. It is a notion of permanent soft pressure, which finds form via the computer and digital media to manage your own time in relationship to broader networks. The discursive demonstrates a neurotic relationship to the management of time as a negatively activated excessive discussion, discourse, and hanging around. The rise of teamwork and networks is linked to a denial of the location of complex and disturbing old-school production relationships that still exist as a phantom for progressive thinkers. The notion of flexibility within the workplace is a way to encourage people to rationalize their own disappearance or redundancy when necessary. Working situations are not changed. The idea is that you have to change. Maybe we have to think about revised languages of production within the context of self-management. Via small, multiple, flexible groupings, the discursive art context intends to go beyond an echo or a mirroring of simple production relations. Though they remain subject to the same complexities that afflict any self-managed environment, even when they refuse to create a timetable. As a production cycle rather than as a fixed performative moment in time, the discursive uses certain production analogies in relation to what could be useful, instead of a permanent association of freed time. It occupies the increasing gap between the trajectory of modernity, understood here as a flow of technologies and demographic developments, and the somewhat melancholic, imploded, self-conscious trajectory of modernism. It is within this zone that we can explain the idea of no surprise, sudden returns, and acceptance of gains and losses as simultaneous symptoms and catalysts. It is here that we can build contingent critical structures that critique both modernity and its critical double.
This is about wanting to be separate but not marginal, a legacy of my Irish heritage. In the book, Literally No Place, Communes, Bars and Green Rooms, I told the true story of a bar in Derry in the north of Ireland, situated in close proximity to a functioning British Army checkpoint. This story had little to do with going out onto the street and banging dustbin lids, or trying to shoot a soldier, or making art about the things we already know. It was about setting up a social checkpoint, opposite an army checkpoint, a place of discourse within confrontation. Sitting in a bar, in a bunker, right underneath an army post. A normal bar on a Friday night with chintzy things hanging on the walls. Nice red wallpaper, old ladies, children, and Guinness sitting up on the bar. From the outside, it's a concrete bunker and an incredible site of resistance, and on the inside, it's a place of the familiar and of difference. A site that refuses to reflect back to the dominant system that which it already knows, but muddies the message, makes it dirty with the chatter of the everyday. Separate but not marginal, an articulation of difference rather than contradiction. A site of exclusion within the context of a desire for autonomy. The picture of a series of relationships where the question is not, am I included in this structure? Does it represent me? Does it fulfill a fantasy of social work within the cultural terrain? Or, but what about them? But it's an implicated space of pleasure and resistance. Thank you.